before the waters rose, before the earth was cleansed, before the towers fell and the cities drowned beneath the weight of divine judgment, there walked upon the earth beings who should never have existed. They were called Nephilim, giants born of forbidden union, children of fallen angels and the daughters of men. They were not merely tall, they were corruption made flesh, and they did not walk the earth in silence. They worshipped, they built altars, they raised temples to powers older than the flood. They bent their knees to forces that should have remained nameless. Their religion was not like the quiet faith of the righteous. It was vast, terrible, and stained with blood. It echoed with the names of their fathers, the watchers who had descended from heaven and taught humanity what should have remained hidden. What did these giants believe? To whom did they pray? What sacred texts did they preserve in stone and clay before the deluge swept it all away? The Book of Enoch speaks of them. The Book of Jubilees remembers their corruption. Genesis whispers their end. But the full story of their worship, their rituals, their priests, their gods, has been scattered across forgotten fragments, apocryphal scrolls, and ancient warnings preserved by scribes who feared to speak too plainly. This is not a story of heroes. It is a story of what happens when heaven's order is broken, when angels fall, when humanity forgets its creator, when giants rule the earth and declare themselves divine. It is a story of forbidden knowledge, blood-soaked altars, and a world so corrupted that only water could wash it clean. Tonight, we will walk slowly through the age before the flood. We will uncover what the Nephilim worshipped, how they practiced their religion, and why their existence demanded the most catastrophic judgment in all of Scripture. Let the waters of memory rise. Let the forgotten temples emerge once more. Before the giants walked the earth, there was heaven, there was order, there was light undimmed by rebellion. Angels dwelt in the presence of God, their purpose fixed, their station eternal. They were called watchers, not because they slumbered, but because they observed. They looked down upon the world below and saw the unfolding of creation. But something shifted, not in heaven, in the hearts of those who dwelt there. The Book of Enoch records what happened next. 200 angels made a choice. They looked upon the daughters of men and saw beauty. They saw flesh. They saw desire where only duty should have been. And in that moment, the boundary between the divine and the mortal began to crack. Their leader was Semjaza. His name meant the name of God, but his actions would become the opposite of all that name stood for. He gathered the others, Azazel, Arakiel, Barakijel, Kakebel, Ezekiel, Armaros, and more, 200 in total. They stood together in the heavenly realm and made a pact. They swore an oath to one another, binding themselves to rebellion. They feared that if only one descended, the guilt would rest on him alone. So they agreed, all would fall together. And then they descended. Mount Hermon became the place of their landing, a high peak, snow-capped and remote, standing between earth and sky. It was there that heaven touched the world. It was there that angels abandoned their first estate. They did not arrive in judgment. They did not come as messengers of God. They came for themselves, for their own desire, for the daughters of men. Genesis speaks of this moment in only a few words. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. But the apocryphal texts reveal what Genesis leaves unspoken. The watchers did not simply take wives. They violated the order of creation itself. Angels were not made to marry. Humans were not made to bear the children of celestial beings. The union was forbidden not by arbitrary decree, but by the very fabric of existence. Yet the watchers did not care. They descended. They touched the earth. They took human women as their own. And from these unions, something new was born, something that should never have existed. The Nephilim. The word means fallen ones, not fallen from heaven, but fallen into being, born of the fall, offspring of rebellion. They were neither angel nor human. They carried the blood of both and the curse of both. Genesis calls them giants, but they were more than tall. They were corruption made flesh. They grew to enormous size, their strength unnatural, their appetites insatiable. They possessed knowledge stolen from heaven, secrets their fathers had brought with them when they fell. The earth had never seen such beings. Humanity looked upon them with awe and terror. Some worshipped them, some fled from them, but none could deny their power. The Nephilim were not accidents. They were the result of a cosmic crime. Their very existence was an affront to the Creator, a violation of His sacred boundary between the celestial and the mortal. And so the stage was set. The world would never be the same. The Watchers did not fall in silence. Their descent was deliberate. Their rebellion was planned. Semjaza had demanded an oath before any angel took the final step. He knew the weight of what they were about to do. He knew that once they crossed the boundary, there would be no return. So he gathered them on Mount Hermon and made them swear together. The oath bound them. If one was guilty, all were guilty. If one faced judgment, all would face judgment. The Book of Enoch names them one by one. Semjaza, the leader; Azazel, who would become the most infamous; Arakiel, who taught the signs of the earth; Barakajal, who taught astrology; Kakabel, who revealed the mysteries of the stars; Ezekiel, who gave knowledge of the clouds; Armaros, who taught the resolving of enchantments. Each name carried weight. Each angel had a role in heaven. Each abandoned that role for the daughters of men. They did not descend as servants. They descended as rebels, and they brought with them knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess. The secrets of heaven, the workings of creation, the hidden things reserved for the divine alone. This knowledge would corrupt the world as deeply as their forbidden unions. The daughters of men bore children to the Watchers, and those children were not like other children. They grew rapidly. Their size exceeded all natural proportion. The Book of Enoch describes them as consuming everything: grain, livestock, and eventually humanity itself. They were giants not only in stature but in appetite. The earth groaned under the weight of their existence. Genesis records their presence with chilling brevity. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Mighty men, men of renown, but these were not heroes. They were abominations. Their renown was built on violence and corruption. The Nephilim were hybrids in every sense. They carried angelic strength but mortal flesh. They inherited forbidden knowledge but lacked the wisdom to use it righteously. They lived longer than ordinary humans but not eternally. They existed in a space between worlds, belonging fully to neither, and that division made them dangerous. They did not blend quietly into human society. They dominated it. They ruled over cities and tribes. They took whatever they wanted: food, land, women. Humanity had no power to resist them. The giants were stronger, smarter, and backed by the knowledge their fathers had stolen from heaven. They became warlords, tyrants, kings, and in time some came to be worshipped as gods. The world that had been created good was now twisted. The order that God had established was broken. The Watchers had not simply sinned. They had introduced a new kind of evil into creation, a corruption that could not be undone by repentance or reform. The Nephilim were living proof of that corruption. Every breath they took was a violation of divine law. And heaven watched. God saw what the Watchers had done. He saw the giants walking the earth. He saw the violence spreading like a plague. The Book of Enoch records that the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, came before God and reported what was happening below. The earth cried out. The blood of the innocent soaked the ground. The corruption was complete. The crime of the Watchers was not a momentary lapse. It was a sustained rebellion that reshaped the world. They had abandoned their heavenly posts. They had taken human wives. They had fathered children who should never have existed, and they had taught humanity secrets that were meant to remain hidden. Each act compounded the next. Each choice deepened the corruption. The Nephilim grew in number and power. They spread across the earth, establishing their dominance in every region. Some stood taller than cedars. Others possessed strength that could break stone. They were not uniform in appearance or ability, but they shared a common origin, the forbidden union of angel and human. And they carried within them the mark of that union, a nature divided, a soul corrupted, a destiny without redemption. Genesis does not linger on their story. It moves quickly from their birth to the judgment that would follow. But the apocryphal texts preserve what Genesis leaves unsaid. The Book of Enoch describes a world drowning in violence and sorcery. The Nephilim consumed everything in their path. When the resources of men ran out, they turned on humanity itself. When human flesh was not enough, they turned on each other. The earth became a place of unending bloodshed. This was not simply moral failure. It was cosmic disorder. The Watchers had violated the structure of creation. They had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be. Crossed, angels were made to serve God in the heavenly realm. Humans were made to live and die on earth. The two were never intended to merge. The Nephilim were proof of what happened when that boundary was broken: chaos, violence, and corruption on a scale that threatened all of creation. Heaven could not remain silent. The archangels petitioned God to act. They had witnessed the suffering below. They had seen the innocent crushed beneath the weight of the giants. They had watched as the knowledge of the Watchers spread like poison through every nation. Something had to be done. The world could not continue as it was. And God responded, not with immediate fire, but with a plan that would unfold across generations. The Watchers would be bound. The Nephilim would be destroyed. The earth would be cleansed. But first, the full measure of their rebellion had to be revealed. The world had to see where the path of the Watchers led. It had to witness the consequences of violating divine order. The stage was set for judgment. The giants walked the earth, unaware that their days were numbered. The Watchers continued to corrupt and teach, not knowing that chains were being prepared for them in the depths of the earth. Humanity lived in fear and darkness, not yet understanding that a flood was coming, a flood that would wash away every trace of the Nephilim and their father's sin. Before there were giants, there were angels who chose to fall. They descended to Mount Hermon. They took human wives. They fathered the Nephilim. And in doing so, they set in motion a sequence of events that would lead to the greatest judgment the world had ever known. The cosmic crime had been committed. The offspring of rebellion had been born, and the earth would never be the same until the waters rose and covered it all. The descent of the Watchers was complete. The birth of the Nephilim was accomplished. Now the world would learn what it meant to live under the rule of giants. The Watchers did not descend and then vanish. They remained. They walked among humanity. They spoke. They taught. And what they taught changed the world forever. The Book of Enoch preserves the record of their teachings. It names each angel and lists what knowledge he brought to earth. These were not simple lessons. They were secrets, mysteries reserved for heaven, never intended for mortal hands. The Watchers had stolen what belonged to God and handed it to a humanity that was unprepared to receive it. Azazel was the first and most infamous teacher. He taught men how to forge swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He revealed the metals hidden within the earth, iron, copper, bronze, and showed them how to extract and shape these elements into tools of war. Before Azazel's teaching, humanity had lived without such weapons. Conflict had been limited. Violence had been restrained by the weakness of human hands. But now men could kill with precision. They could arm themselves for battle. They could destroy one another on a scale never before imagined. Azazel did not stop with weapons. He taught women the art of adornment. He showed them how to make bracelets, ornaments, and jewelry set with costly stones. He revealed the use of antimony, a dark powder used to beautify the eyelids. He introduced cosmetics, dyes, and tinctures that could alter appearance and enhance beauty. These teachings may seem harmless compared to weapons of war, but the Book of Enoch treats them with equal gravity. The adornment of the body became a path to vanity. It stirred desire, competition, and pride. It turned attention away from the Creator and toward the self. The fallen angel knew what he was doing. He was not simply sharing knowledge. He was corrupting the human heart. Weapons gave men power over life and death. Cosmetics gave women power over desire and seduction. Both teachings led humanity away from dependence on God and toward dependence on craft, manipulation, and violence. Semjaza, the leader of the Watchers, taught his own dark arts. He instructed humanity in enchantments and root cutting, the manipulation of plants and nature through sorcery. This was not herbalism for healing. It was magic. It was the use of natural elements to bend reality, to curse enemies, to summon forces beyond the mortal realm. Semjaza opened a door that should have remained closed. He taught humanity to reach into the unseen world and draw out power that was not theirs to command. Armaros followed with teachings of his own. He revealed how to resolve enchantments, how to break curses, undo spells, and counter the magic that Semjaza had taught. The knowledge created a cycle: enchantment and counter-enchantment, curse and cure. Humanity became locked in a spiritual war that used tools never meant for them. The corruption spread beyond weapons and sorcery. Other Watchers stepped forward with knowledge of the heavens. Barakijal taught astrology, the study of the stars and their influence over human affairs. He revealed how to read the movements of celestial bodies, how to predict events by their alignment, how to attribute power to the constellations. This was not innocent stargazing. It was the worship of creation rather than the Creator. It taught humanity to look to the stars for guidance instead of looking to God. Cockabeel joined him, teaching the constellations themselves, their names, their patterns, their supposed meanings. He gave humanity a map of the heavens that turned distant lights into objects of reverence and fear. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds, how to interpret weather, how to predict storms, how to read signs in the sky. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth, omens found in soil, stone, and shadow. Shamsiel revealed the signs of the sun. Each angel contributed another piece of forbidden wisdom, another way for humanity to seek control over forces beyond their reach. These teachings were not gifts, they were thefts. The Watchers had taken what belonged to heaven and handed it to mortals who lacked the wisdom to use it righteously. Knowledge without wisdom breeds arrogance. Power without restraint breeds violence. Humanity received both, and the result was catastrophic. The Book of Enoch records the consequence clearly. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. The teachings of the Watchers did not elevate humanity. They corrupted it. Men turned the knowledge of metallurgy into instruments of murder. Women turned the knowledge of adornment into tools of seduction and envy. Sorcerers twisted the knowledge of roots and enchantments into curses that brought suffering and death. Astrologers abandoned trust in God and placed their faith in stars that could neither hear nor save. The world descended into chaos. Violence spread like wildfire. The knowledge of warfare meant that conflicts escalated beyond anything humanity had known. Tribes armed themselves with bronze and iron. Battles grew bloodier. Death became commonplace. The enchantments taught by Semjaza filled the land with sorcery and false religion. Humanity began to worship the Watchers themselves, seeing them as gods who had revealed sacred mysteries. And the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers, inherited all of this knowledge. They were not ignorant brutes. They were intelligent, cunning, and steeped in the forbidden wisdom their fathers had brought from heaven. They became warriors, yes, but also sorcerers, astrologers, and priests. They used the knowledge of metallurgy to arm themselves with weapons no human could wield. They used the knowledge of enchantment to curse their enemies and enslave the weak. They used the knowledge of the stars to claim divine authority and prophetic insight. The Nephilim became the elite of the antediluvian world, a ruling class empowered not only by physical strength but by intellectual and spiritual corruption. They stood at the intersection of heaven and earth, wielding secrets that should have remained beyond mortal reach. They were living symbols of the rebellion of their fathers. Every sword they forged, every spell they cast, every star they consulted was a reminder that the order of creation had been violated. The teachings of the Watchers were not neutral information. They carried a curse within them. Every lesson learned from the fallen angels drew humanity further from God and deeper into corruption. The knowledge was real. The power was functional, but it was never meant to belong to mortals. It was heaven's property, stolen and distributed without divine permission. The Book of Enoch makes clear that these teachings brought about the moral collapse of the antediluvian world. Men became violent. Women became vain. The earth filled with bloodshed and sorcery. Humanity's attention turned away from the Creator who had made them and toward the skills, secrets, and powers they had received from the Watchers. They became self-sufficient in the worst possible way, dependent not on God, but on forbidden knowledge. The Nephilim embodied this corruption fully. They were not merely the biological offspring of angels and humans. They were the intellectual and spiritual heirs of the Watchers' rebellion. They possessed strength beyond measure, yes, but they also possessed knowledge beyond their station. They knew how to craft weapons that could pierce armor and shatter bone. They knew how to manipulate nature through enchantments and root cutting. They knew how to read the stars and claim authority over the fates of men. They became priests of dark mysteries, teaching others what their fathers had taught them. This was a priesthood of corruption. It stood in opposition to the righteous line that still remembered God, the line of Seth, the line that would eventually produce Noah. While the Nephilim and their human followers practiced sorcery and astrology, a remnant remained faithful. But that remnant was small. The corruption had spread too far. The knowledge of the Watchers had infected nearly every corner of the earth. The world that had once been simple and good was now complex and evil. Humanity had gained knowledge but lost innocence. They had learned to forge metal but used it to kill. They had learned to adorn themselves but used it to provoke lust and envy. They had learned to read the stars but turned them into objects of worship. They had learned to manipulate nature but used it for curses and destruction. Every gift became a weapon. Every secret became a trap. The Watchers had succeeded in their corruption. They had not simply fathered giants. They had reshaped humanity's relationship with knowledge itself. They had taught mortals to seek power without wisdom, to pursue mastery without submission to the Creator, to grasp at divine secrets without divine authority. And the result was a world drowning in violence, sorcery, and rebellion. Heaven watched this unfold. The archangels observed the suffering below and brought their report before God. The earth cried out under the weight of corruption. The knowledge that had been stolen was now spreading like poison through every generation. The Nephilim, armed with forbidden wisdom, ruled as tyrant priests over a world that had forgotten its maker. The teachings of the Watchers had accomplished what their descent began. They had turned the earth into a place of chaos. They had given humanity tools it could not responsibly wield. They had elevated the Nephilim into positions of power that combined physical dominance with spiritual corruption. The world had been transformed, and it could not be allowed to continue. The forbidden knowledge had been unleashed. The giants had inherited it. The earth had been corrupted by it, and judgment was coming. The Nephilim did not cower in shame. They did not hide their origin or apologize for their existence. They walked the earth with heads held high, seeing themselves not as abominations but as something greater than humanity. They were taller, stronger, and possessed knowledge stolen from heaven. In their eyes, this made them superior. In their hearts, they believed themselves divine. Ancient texts describe them as towering figures whose presence dominated every landscape they entered. They were not uniform in size, but all exceeded the natural proportions of men. Some stood twice the height of an ordinary human. Others rose even higher, casting shadows that stretched across entire villages. Their strength was unmatched. They could move stones that required dozens of men to lift. They could break iron with their hands. They were harder to kill than ordinary mortals, their hybrid nature granting them resilience that bordered on the supernatural. But physical dominance was only the beginning. The Nephilim consumed resources on a scale that humanity had never known. The Book of Enoch records that they devoured all the acquisitions of men, grain, livestock, the fruits of labor. Humanity toiled endlessly to feed them, but the giants' appetites were insatiable. Fields were stripped bare. Flocks were slaughtered. Storehouses were emptied. The earth groaned under the weight of their consumption. When the resources of humanity ran out, the Nephilim did not simply starve. They turned violent. The Book of Enoch states clearly what happened next. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. The giants became cannibals. They consumed human flesh. They drank human blood. They began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, hunting and devouring every living thing in their path. Some texts even suggest they turned on one another, consuming the flesh of their own kind when no other prey remained. This was not mere hunger. It was corruption manifested in the most visceral way possible. The Nephilim were hybrids, neither fully angel nor fully human, and their appetites reflected that unnatural state. They existed outside the order of creation, and their behavior demonstrated the chaos that followed such a violation. The earth itself cried out against them, accusing the lawless ones before heaven. Yet despite their monstrous behavior, humanity did not universally reject them. Fear has a way of transforming into reverence. The Nephilim were powerful. They were terrifying. And in the ancient world, power and terror often became indistinguishable from divinity. The giants began to position themselves not as oppressors but as rulers, not as monsters but as gods. The Nephilim understood something fundamental about human nature. Those who possess overwhelming power are often worshipped by those who lack it. They were stronger than any man. They lived longer than any human generation. They possessed knowledge taught by the Watchers, secrets of warfare, sorcery, and the stars. All of this gave them an aura that ordinary mortals could not match, and they used that aura deliberately. They began to present themselves as intermediaries between heaven and earth. They claimed that their angelic bloodline gave them special access to divine mysteries. They positioned themselves as the only ones who could interpret the will of the heavens, read the signs of the stars, and perform rituals that secured favor from forces beyond mortal understanding. Humanity, desperate for protection and prosperity, began to believe them. Altars were built in their honor. These were not small shrines hidden in remote places. They were massive stone structures erected in the centers of villages and cities. The Nephilim demanded tribute. They required sacrifices. Grain was brought to them as offerings. Livestock were slaughtered at their command. Human populations presented the fruit of their labor not as payment to tyrants, but as worship offered to gods. The giants did not refuse this worship. They embraced it. They held themselves above humanity, claiming authority over harvests, weather, and tribal law. They declared themselves the rightful rulers of the earth, beings whose hybrid nature made them superior to ordinary men. Some ancient traditions preserve echoes of this belief, stories of demigods who walked among mortals, performed great deeds, and demanded reverence in return. The Greek myths speak of titans and heroes born of divine unions. The Norse sagas tell of giants who challenged the gods. Many scholars see in these legends the distorted memory of the Nephilim. The transformation was complete. The cursed offspring of fallen angels had become objects of worship. Humanity no longer saw them primarily as threats. They saw them as powerful beings whose favor could be secured through sacrifice and obedience. The Nephilim became priest kings, warrior gods, sorcerer rulers who dominated not only through physical strength but through spiritual authority. They controlled the rituals that governed daily life. They determined when crops should be planted and when battles should be fought. They interpreted omens and claimed to predict the future through the knowledge of astrology their fathers had taught them. Human populations became dependent on them, not just for protection from violence, but for guidance in navigating a world that had become deeply corrupted and spiritually confused. The Nephilim lived longer than ordinary men, and this too reinforced their divine status. Generations of humans were born, lived, and died while the same giants continued to rule. Their longevity gave them an appearance of permanence, as if they were eternal beings who would never pass away. To the short-lived humans who served them, the giants seemed almost immortal, further proof of their godlike nature. The worship of the Nephilim was not abstract theology. It was practical religion born of fear and need. Humanity had been reduced to a position of dependence. The giants controlled the weapons forged from metals they alone understood. They commanded the sorcery taught by their fallen fathers. They interpreted the stars and claimed to know the will of heaven. To oppose them was to invite destruction. To worship them was to seek survival. But this worship was built on a lie. The Nephilim were not gods. They were abominations, creatures whose very existence violated the order of creation. They were born of rebellion, steeped in forbidden knowledge, and sustained by violence and consumption. Their claim to divinity was nothing more than the arrogance of beings who possessed power without righteousness. Yet the lie was believed. Human populations bowed before them. Sacrifices were offered at their altars. Prayers were spoken in their names. The giants became the center of religious life in the antediluvian world. They were honored not as conquerors, but as deities worthy of reverence. The line between oppressor and God had been erased. Some scholars suggest that the memory of this worship survived the flood and re-emerged in the mythologies of later civilizations. The Greek pantheon included stories of giants who challenged the gods, the Gigantes, born of Gaia, who waged war against the Olympians. The Titans, powerful beings who ruled before Zeus, bore similarities to the Nephilim, beings of immense strength who were eventually overthrown by divine judgment. Norse mythology told of the Jotnar, giants who existed in opposition to the gods but were worshipped in their own right by certain peoples. These legends may be echoes, distorted, mythologized, but rooted in the ancient memory of giants who walked the earth and demanded worship. The Book of Enoch does not celebrate the Nephilim. It condemns them. It describes them as lawless beings whose actions brought corruption and violence upon the earth. It records how the earth cried out against them, how their sins reached heaven, and how judgment was decreed. But before that judgment fell, the giants ruled, and humanity worshipped them. This was the ultimate inversion. The creatures born of rebellion against God had become objects of religious devotion. The offspring of fallen angels had positioned themselves as intermediaries between heaven and earth, when in truth they represented the severing of that connection. They claimed divine authority while living lives marked by violence, cannibalism, and corruption. They built altars and received sacrifices while stripping the earth bare and consuming the very people who honored them. The world had become unrecognizable. What had once been a place of order and goodness was now dominated by giants who saw themselves as gods. Humanity, created to worship the one true Creator, now bowed before hybrid beings whose existence itself was a cosmic crime. The Nephilim had transformed from cursed offspring into priest kings, from monsters into objects of worship. But their reign would not last forever. Heaven was watching. The archangels had seen the altars raised in honor of the giants. They had witnessed the sacrifices offered to beings who had no right to receive them. They had heard the cries of the earth as it groaned under the weight of corruption. Judgment was coming. The giants who walked as gods would soon learn that they were not divine. They were mortal, and their end was near. The worship of the Nephilim was not a matter of contemplation or prayer whispered in quiet solitude. It was physical. It was violent. It was built on blood and stone. The giants did not demand abstract devotion. They required tribute that could be seen, touched, and poured out upon altars constructed from rocks so massive that only beings of immense strength could move them. Altars rose across the antediluvian world. They were not delicate structures. They were monuments of raw power, built from megaliths that weighed tons. The stones were hewn from quarries, dragged across valleys, and lifted into place by hands far stronger than those of ordinary men. Some legends preserved in ancient cultures suggest that these massive structures were the work of giants, beings who could move stones as easily as a child stacks wooden blocks. Archaeological mysteries persist to this day. Across the ancient world stand megalithic sites whose origins remain disputed. Stonehenge in Britain, Newgrange in Ireland, the temples of Malta, the massive stones of Baalbek in Lebanon. Modern historians attribute these structures to advanced human engineering, but local legends tell a different story. They speak of giants who once walked the earth, beings of great strength who built temples and monuments that ordinary humans could never construct alone. The Maltese temples of Jiwith Gantija bear a name that means Giant's Tower. Local tradition claims they were built by a giantess named Sensuna, who carried stones while holding her child on her shoulder. Lebanese folklore surrounding the megaliths of Baalbek tells of giant beings who lifted enormous stones and placed them into foundations with ease, as if they weighed nothing. Irish myths speak of the Fomorians, an ancient race of giants who were eventually defeated, but left behind megalithic structures like Newgrange. These are legends, yes, but they are consistent. Across continents and cultures, the same story repeats. Giants built the stones. Some scholars wonder if these tales preserve a memory of the Nephilim, a time before the flood when beings of great strength constructed altars and temples to honor themselves and their fallen fathers. The stones remain. The builders are gone, but the legends endure. The altars were not built for beauty. They were built for sacrifice. Blood was poured out upon them. Animals were slaughtered in vast numbers, bulls, sheep, goats brought by human populations who feared the giants and sought their favor. The rituals were not gentle. They were brutal displays of power, designed to remind humanity of their dependence on the Nephilim. The sacrifices began with grain and livestock, but they did not end there. The Book of Enoch and other apocryphal texts hint at darker offerings. As the corruption of the antediluvian world deepened, so too did the demands of the Nephilim. They required more than animals. They required human lives. Ancient Mesopotamian practices preserved in later cultures may reflect this ancient pattern. Human sacrifice was not uncommon in the civilizations that followed the flood: Babylon, Canaan, Carthage. Children were offered to Molech. Captives were slaughtered on altars to Baal. The firstborn of conquered peoples were given as tribute to bloodthirsty gods. These practices did not arise from nowhere. They were echoes of something older, something that predated even the earliest known civilizations. The Nephilim demanded tribute from the populations they ruled. Grain was brought to their altars. Livestock were slaughtered at their command. But when famine struck, when resources dwindled, when the giants' insatiable appetites could not be satisfied by animals alone, darker sacrifices were demanded. Infants, captives, the firstborn of tribes who had displeased the giants. Blood was poured out in rivers. The altars ran red. This was not worship that offered salvation or enlightenment. It was worship built on terror. The Nephilim were not benevolent deities who blessed their followers. They were tyrants who consumed everything in their path. The sacrifices were not offerings of gratitude. They were payments made in fear, tributes designed to prevent the giants from turning their wrath upon the villages and tribes that served them. The rituals performed at these megalithic altars were designed to honor not only the Nephilim, but also their fallen fathers, the Watchers. The giants positioned themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the angelic realm. They claimed that their hybrid nature gave them special access to divine mysteries, and the sacrifices performed at their altars were meant to secure favor from the spiritual forces their fathers had introduced into the world. Blood was central to these rituals. It was poured out upon the stones. It was collected in basins. It was offered to the Nephilim as proof of humanity's submission. The giants believed, or claimed to believe, that blood held power, that it could bind the spiritual and physical realms together, that it could secure blessings or avert curses. Whether they truly believed this or simply used it as a means of control is unclear. What is certain is that blood flowed freely at their altars. The religion of the Nephilim was not about personal transformation or moral improvement. It was about power. The giants held power through physical strength, through forbidden knowledge, and through spiritual intimidation. The altars and sacrifices reinforced that power. They reminded humanity of their place in the order the Nephilim had created, an order built on violence, fear, and the corruption of everything sacred. The stones stood as silent witnesses to the corruption of the age. They were monuments not to holiness but to rebellion. Every megalith raised by the Nephilim was a declaration of their dominance, a physical marker of their claim to divinity. The altars were not places of communion with the true Creator. They were stages for rituals that bound humanity to a corrupted order. The giants understood the power of physical symbols. A massive stone altar visible from miles away communicated authority in a way that words never could. When human populations saw these structures, they were reminded of the strength required to build them, strength that no ordinary man possessed. When they approached these altars to offer sacrifice, they were reminded of their dependence on the giants and the spiritual forces the Nephilim claimed to represent. The religion of blood and stone was designed to bind, to control, to ensure that humanity remained subservient to the Nephilim. Every sacrifice performed was an act of submission. Every animal slaughtered reinforced the giants' authority. Every human life taken in their name deepened the corruption that had spread across the earth. The Book of Enoch describes a world so corrupt that the earth itself cried out against it. The violence had become unbearable. The bloodshed had reached a level that could not be ignored. The giants consumed everything: resources, animals, and eventually human flesh. Their altars ran red with the blood of countless sacrifices. Their religion had transformed the world into a place of unending horror. This was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of rebellion against divine order. The Watchers had descended and violated the boundary between heaven and earth. The Nephilim, born of that violation, embodied the chaos that followed. Their religion reflected their nature, brutal, physical, rooted in domination rather than devotion. They had no interest in guiding humanity toward righteousness. They sought only to maintain their power and satisfy their appetites. The megalithic structures they left behind may still stand in scattered corners of the earth. Some have been buried by time and sediment. Others remain visible, provoking questions that modern scholars struggle to answer. How were these stones moved? Who built them? Why were they constructed with such precision and effort? The legends say giants built them. The evidence leaves room for wonder. But whether these specific stones are relics of the Nephilim or not, the principle remains the same. The religion of the giants was real. It was brutal. It was centered on blood sacrifice and megalithic monuments that declared their power. It was a system designed to bind humanity in fear, to extract tribute through violence, and to position the Nephilim as the rightful rulers of a world they had corrupted. Heaven saw it all. The archangels observed the altars and the blood poured out upon them. They witnessed the human lives taken in the name of beings who had no right to receive worship. They heard the cries of the earth as it groaned under the weight of corruption and violence. The religion of blood and stone could not be allowed to continue. Judgment was coming. The stones would be buried. The altars would be drowned. The blood would be washed away. The giants who demanded worship would learn that they were not gods. They were abominations, and their reign was ending. The Nephilim did not perform their rituals alone. They were giants, yes, physically dominant and supernaturally powerful, but they understood that religion requires more than raw strength. It requires structure. It requires servants. It requires human intermediaries who could stand between the giants and the populations that worshipped them. And so a priesthood emerged. These were not priests of the true God. They were servants of the Nephilim and their fallen fathers. They were men, and perhaps women, who had been chosen or coerced into serving the giants as religious functionaries. They wore robes that distinguished them from common people. They adorned themselves with crowns and ornaments that signaled their elevated status. They spoke in ancient tongues taught to them by the Watchers, languages that carried the weight of forbidden knowledge. The Book of Jubilees hints at this corrupted priesthood. It describes a time before the flood when humanity turned away from the Creator and embraced false worship. People made high places and groves. They carved graven images. They sacrificed their children to demons and served the works of error in their hearts. This was not spontaneous chaos. It was organized religion, structured, ritualized, and led by those who claimed special access to spiritual powers. These priests were granted knowledge that ordinary humans did not possess. The Watchers taught them astrology, the reading of stars and their supposed influence over earthly events. They taught them divination, the practice of discerning hidden truths through omens, signs, and ritual manipulation. They taught them incantations, words of power meant to summon, bind, or banish spiritual forces. They taught them the secret names of angels and demons, believing that knowledge of a being's true name granted authority over it. This knowledge set the priests apart. It made them necessary. The common people could not interpret the stars. They could not perform the rituals. They could not speak the incantations or invoke the names that the Watchers had revealed. Only the priests possessed this knowledge, and they used it to secure their position as intermediaries between humanity and the Nephilim. The priests claimed to interpret the will of the giants. When the Nephilim demanded sacrifice, the priests proclaimed it. When the stars aligned in a particular pattern, the priests declared what it meant. When omens appeared in the earth or sky, the priests explained their significance. They became the voice of the giants, translating supernatural authority into commands that the people could understand and obey. The priesthood maintained sacred texts. These were not scrolls of divine revelation given by the Creator. They were records of forbidden knowledge written on clay tablets and stone. They preserved the teachings of the Watchers, instructions for forging weapons, performing sorcery, reading the stars, and invoking spiritual forces. These texts were guarded carefully, accessible only to those initiated into the priesthood. The priests memorized incantations passed down from the fallen angels. They learned the secret names that the Watchers had revealed, names of angels who had remained loyal to heaven, and names of demons who had joined the rebellion. The belief was simple but powerful. To know a being's true name was to possess authority over it. A priest who could speak these names correctly could summon, command, or banish spiritual entities. Whether this power was real or simply believed to be real mattered little. The priests used it to maintain control. Temples rose alongside the megalithic altars. These were not simple structures. They were centers of religious authority where the priests conducted their rituals. Within these temples, liturgies were chanted in languages that echoed the speech of the watchers. Sacrifices were prepared according to precise instructions. Divination was performed to discern the will of the giants and interpret the movements of the stars. The Book of Jubilees speaks of a generation that sought communion with unclean spirits rather than with the Creator. This was not accidental deviation. It was deliberate inversion. The priesthood of the Nephilim taught humanity to look away from God and toward the spiritual forces that the Watchers had introduced into the world. They replaced reverence for the Creator with fear of the giants. They replaced prayer with incantation. They replaced trust in divine providence with dependence on astrology and divination. The unclean spirits they sought communion with were likely the disembodied entities that the Book of Enoch describes, the spirits of dead Nephilim who could not ascend to heaven and remained bound to the earth. These spirits became the focus of rituals designed to gain favor, knowledge, or protection. The priests acted as mediators between humanity and these unclean forces, claiming that they alone possessed the knowledge necessary to navigate the spiritual realm safely. The liturgies performed in the temples were not prayers of repentance or gratitude. They were declarations of submission. They honored the Nephilim as rulers. They invoked the names of the Watchers as sources of power. They called upon unclean spirits as allies and guides. The entire system was designed to bind humanity to the corrupted order the giants had established. The priests wore their robes and crowns as symbols of authority. They spoke in ancient tongues to maintain mystery and distance. They preserved forbidden texts to ensure their indispensability. They performed rituals that reinforced the power structure of the antediluvian world, a world ruled by giants, served by a corrupted priesthood, and steeped in the worship of unclean spirits. The memory of true worship had not been entirely forgotten. Somewhere in the world, a remnant remained, men and women who still called upon the name of the Lord. But they were few. The corrupted priesthood had captured the religious imagination of most of humanity. The priests of the Nephilim had twisted the very concept of worship, turning it into something unrecognizable. Where true worship sought communion with a holy God, the priesthood of the giants sought power over spiritual forces. Where true worship called for humility and obedience, the dark liturgies of the Nephilim demanded submission through fear. Where true worship offered hope of redemption, the religion of the giants offered only the promise of temporary protection in exchange for endless tribute. The priests taught that the giants were divine intermediaries whose favor had to be secured through sacrifice and ritual. They taught that the stars controlled human destiny and that only through astrology could the future be known. They taught that spiritual power could be manipulated through incantations and the invocation of secret names. Every teaching moved humanity further from the Creator and deeper into the corrupted order the Watchers had established. The sacred texts preserved on clay and stone became the foundation of this false religion. They contained instructions for performing rituals, lists of powerful names, astrological charts, and records of the teachings the Watchers had given. These texts were treated as holy, not because they revealed the will of God, but because they granted access to forbidden knowledge. The priests guarded them jealously, ensuring that their position as intermediaries could not be challenged. The temples where these liturgies were performed became centers of spiritual darkness. Within their walls, sacrifices were offered to beings who had no right to receive them. Blood was poured out in the names of the Nephilim and their fallen fathers. Incantations were chanted to summon unclean spirits. Divination was practiced to interpret omens and predict events. The entire structure existed to maintain the power of the giants and bind humanity to their corrupted order. The Book of Jubilees describes this corruption with sorrow. It records how humanity made graven images and served demons. It tells of a generation that walked in transgression and uncleanness, abandoning the Creator who had made them. The priesthood of the Nephilim played a central role in this apostasy. They were the ones who preserved the forbidden knowledge. They were the ones who performed the dark rituals. They were the ones who taught humanity to fear the giants and honor unclean spirits. Heaven saw it all. The archangels observed the temples and the priests who served in them. They witnessed the liturgies chanted in ancient tongues, the sacrifices offered to the Nephilim, the communion sought with unclean spirits. They heard the cries of the righteous remnant who still remembered the true God, and they brought their report before the throne. The corrupted priesthood had replaced reverence for God with fear of the giants. They had twisted the memory of true worship into something dark and brutal. They had taught humanity to seek power through forbidden knowledge rather than wisdom through obedience to the Creator. The religion they established was built on lies, maintained through fear, and steeped in spiritual corruption. But their time was ending. The temples would be destroyed. The sacred texts would be lost beneath the waters. The priests would drown alongside the giants they served. The dark liturgies would be silenced, and the world would learn that no priesthood built on rebellion could stand forever. The Nephilim died. Their bodies fell in battle, succumbed to violence, or were swept away by the waters of the flood. But their story did not end with physical death. The Book of Enoch teaches that because the giants were born of both spirit and flesh, offspring of angelic watchers and human women, their deaths were unlike ordinary mortality. When a human dies, the body returns to dust and the spirit goes to its appointed place. But the Nephilim were hybrids. They belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth. And so their fate was different. Their bodies returned to dust, yes, but their spirits remained. The Book of Enoch records God's decree concerning them. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits they shall be called. The spirits of the giants, unnatural and unable to ascend to heaven, became bound to the earth. They were denied entry to the heavenly realm because of their corrupted origin. They could not rest in Sheol in the normal way because they were not fully human. These disembodied spirits became what later generations called demons. They were the unclean spirits that wandered the earth, seeking to oppress, deceive, and corrupt humanity. The Book of Enoch describes their activities. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. They were restless entities, driven by appetites they could no longer satisfy, filled with hostility toward the humanity from which they were partially descended. The connection between the Nephilim and demons was understood in ancient Jewish tradition. It explained features of demonic behavior that otherwise seemed puzzling. Demons craved embodiment. They sought to inhabit physical bodies because they had lost their own. The New Testament records demons begging Jesus to allow them to enter a herd of swigs rather than be sent into the abyss. This desperate desire for physical form made sense if demons were the disembodied spirits of beings who once possessed bodies. Demons were numerous and restless, constantly seeking victims. Jesus described unclean spirits as wandering through waterless places, seeking rest but finding none. This matched the condition of the Nephilim spirits, earthbound, unable to ascend, unable to find peace. They roamed the world as predators, driven by the same corruption that had defined them when they walked as giants. The spirits inherited the hostility of their fathers. The Watchers had rebelled against God and corrupted humanity. The Nephilim had ruled through violence and terror. Now their disembodied spirits continued that rebellion in spiritual form. They whispered to men in dreams. They drove people to madness. They led humanity into idolatry and sin. The demons did not merely wander aimlessly. They sought influence. They attached themselves to individuals, families, and entire populations. The Book of Enoch states that God allowed 1/10 of the spirits to remain active on the earth to afflict and oppress humanity, while the remaining 9/10 were bound until the final judgment. Even this reduced number was enough to cause widespread suffering. The unclean spirits whispered temptations. They planted thoughts of violence, lust, and rebellion in the minds of men. They magnified human weaknesses and exploited moral failures. Where humanity was prone to greed, demons stirred avarice. Where people harbored anger, demons inflamed rage. Where hearts turned toward idolatry, demons encouraged false worship. They drove people to madness. The Gospels record numerous encounters with demon-possessed individuals who displayed symptoms that went beyond ordinary illness: supernatural strength, self-destructive behavior, knowledge of hidden things, voices speaking through human mouths. These were the spirits of the Nephilim asserting control over the living, using human bodies as vessels for their continued rebellion. The demons perpetuated idolatry. The worship of false gods that arose after the flood was not merely human invention. It was demonically inspired. The spirits of the Nephilim, who had once been worshipped as gods when they walked the earth in physical form, continued to seek worship in their disembodied state. They positioned themselves behind the idols of ancient civilizations: Baal, Molech, Dagon, Asherah. When people bowed before these images, they were unknowingly venerating the lingering spirits of the giants. Paul's letter to the Corinthians hints at this reality. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. The idols themselves were nothing: wood, stone, metal shaped by human hands. But behind them stood spiritual entities who received the worship and fed on the fear and devout. Iron offered by deceived populations. The demons had transformed their worship. What had once been physical tribute brought to giant overlords became spiritual devotion offered to unseen forces. The religious system of the Nephilim survived the flood in this altered form. The giants were gone, but their spirits remained. The megalithic altars were buried, but new altars rose in their place. The priesthood of the antediluvian world had drowned, but new priests emerged to serve the same spiritual powers under different names. Humanity's tendency toward false worship was exploited by the very entities that had once ruled through physical dominance. The Book of Jubilees describes how, after the flood, unclean spirits continued to lead Noah's descendants astray. They seduced humanity into idolatry, sorcery, and immorality. They worked to corrupt the post-flood world just as they had corrupted the world before it. The demons were patient, they were cunning, and they remembered what it was like to rule. The ministry of Jesus confronted these spirits directly. The Gospels record numerous exorcisms, moments when Jesus cast out demons and restored afflicted individuals to wholeness. These were not symbolic acts. They were direct confrontations with the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. When Jesus commanded unclean spirits to depart, they obeyed. When he rebuked them, they fled. His authority over them was absolute. The demons recognized who Jesus was. They cried out, calling him the Son of God, the Holy One. They begged him not to torment them before the appointed time. They knew their fate was sealed. They knew that judgment awaited them. But until that final day, they continued to afflict humanity, working to corrupt and destroy. The disciples were given authority to cast out demons in Jesus' name. This was not a minor aspect of their ministry. It was central. Everywhere they went, they encountered people oppressed by unclean spirits, the lingering remnants of the Nephilim's rebellion. The apostles drove out demons, healed the afflicted, and proclaimed the kingdom of God as a power greater than the spiritual forces that had dominated humanity since before the flood. The Book of Enoch had prophesied this. It declared that the spirits of the Nephilim would remain active until the final judgment, when they would be cast into the lake of fire along with their fallen fathers, the Watchers. The ministry of Jesus and his followers represented the beginning of that final defeat. Every demon cast out was a declaration that the reign of the Nephilim spirits was ending. But the war was not yet over. The New Testament letters acknowledge that believers continue to struggle against spiritual forces, rulers, authorities, powers of darkness, spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. These are the same entities that originated in the rebellion of the Watchers and the deaths of the Nephilim. They continue to seek influence, to corrupt, to lead humanity astray. The worship of the Nephilim did not die with the flood. It transformed. What had been open reverence of physical giants became hidden veneration of spiritual entities. The altars were rebuilt under new names. The sacrifices continued in different forms. The priesthoods re-established themselves in service to forces they called gods, but which were, in truth, the disembodied spirits of the cursed offspring of angels and humans. This is the theological aftermath of the Nephilim. Their bodies perished, but their corruption endured. They became demons, restless, hostile, forever seeking to afflict humanity and perpetuate the rebellion their fathers began. They are the unclean spirits that wander the earth, the demonic forces that inspire idolatry, the spiritual entities that drive people to madness and sin. The Book of Enoch teaches that God allowed these spirits to remain active as a test and a consequence. Humanity would be afflicted by the very corruption it had once embraced. The giants humanity had worshipped would continue to oppress them in spiritual form. But this would not last forever. A day of final judgment is coming when every demon will be cast into the fire, when every unclean spirit will be silenced, when the rebellion of the Watchers and the legacy of the Nephilim will be erased completely. Until that day, the spirits remain. The demons wander. The worship continues in shadowed form, and the war between light and darkness, between the kingdom of God and the lingering corruption of the Nephilim, goes on. By the time of Noah, the earth had become something unrecognizable. Genesis records it plainly. The earth was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. These were not minor moral failures. This was total corruption, absolute depravity that had infected every corner of the world. The apocryphal texts expand this portrait, adding details that Genesis leaves unspoken. They describe a civilization that had abandoned the Creator almost entirely, and embraced a darkness so complete that only divine judgment could cleanse it. Humanity had turned away from the Lord. The worship of the one true God had become rare, preserved only by a faithful remnant led by men like Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah. The rest of the world bowed before the Nephilim and the spiritual forces their fallen fathers had introduced. Altars to the giants stood in every valley. Blood sacrifice was practiced openly and without shame. The religion of the Watchers had spread across every tribe and nation. The knowledge taught by the fallen angels had turned men into sorcerers and murderers. Warfare had become constant and brutal. The metallurgy taught by Azazel had armed humanity with weapons designed for killing. Swords, knives, shields, and armor were commonplace. Men slaughtered one another without restraint. There was no order, no regular government, no justice. Every man did what was right in his own eyes, and what seemed right was violence. The Book of Jasher describes how people robbed and plundered one another. Neighbors stole from neighbors. Relatives betrayed relatives. Judges and rulers did not uphold justice. They participated in the corruption, taking wives by force and seizing property according to their desires. The powerful oppressed the weak. The strong consumed the vulnerable. Blood was shed without consequence. Genesis states that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. This was not occasional sin. It was constant, pervasive wickedness. Humanity had become so corrupted that goodness itself seemed foreign. The earth was filled with violence, not just physical brutality, but moral chaos, spiritual rebellion, and the complete breakdown of the order God had established at creation. The land itself groaned under the weight of corruption. The violence of men defiled the ground. Blood soaked the soil, crying out to God for justice. The boundaries of creation had been violated at every level. What God had made good had been twisted into something monstrous. The corruption extended beyond human behavior. Ancient texts suggest that the boundaries between species had been violated. The Book of Jasher records that in the days before the flood, all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth, both man and beast and fowl, and whatever creeps upon the earth. This was not natural evolution or ordinary animal behavior. It was unnatural mixing, the corruption of created kinds through forbidden knowledge and dark manipulation. Some scholars interpret this to mean that the knowledge taught by the Watchers included methods for crossbreeding animals in ways that violated the natural order. Hybrid creatures walked the earth, beings that should never have existed, combinations of species that God had made distinct. The corruption that had produced the Nephilim, unions between angelic beings and humans, had established a pattern of boundary violation that spread to the animal kingdom. The world had become a place of chaos. What God had separated, humanity had mixed. What God had ordained as distinct, the Watchers and their followers had blended together. The Nephilim themselves were living symbols of this violation, hybrids who belonged fully to neither heaven nor earth. Their existence normalized the breaking of boundaries, and that corruption spread through every level of creation. The giants ruled as tyrant kings, demanding tribute and worship. They consumed everything in their path: grain, livestock, and eventually human flesh. Their appetites were insatiable. Their violence was unrestrained. They had positioned themselves as gods and forced humanity to bow before them. Their priesthoods performed rituals that honored unclean spirits and invoked the names of demons. The entire religious structure of the antediluvian world had become an organized rebellion against the Creator. Sorcery was widespread. The enchantments and divination taught by Semjaza and the other Watchers had spread through every population. Astrology was practiced openly, with men looking to the stars for guidance instead of to God. Incantations were chanted to summon spiritual forces. The secret names of angels and demons were invoked to manipulate reality. Humanity had become a civilization of sorcerers, each seeking power through forbidden knowledge. The righteous remnant was small. Genesis says that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a just man, perfect in his generations, and he walked with God. But he as nearly alone in this. His family was preserved. His grandfather Methuselah lived until the very year of the flood. Enoch had been taken by God before the worst corruption set in. But beyond this small group, righteousness had almost vanished from the earth. The world that God had made was now barely recognizable. Cities were filled with violence. Altars ran with blood. Temples housed corrupted priesthoods that served demons. The Nephilim ruled with supernatural strength and forbidden knowledge. Humanity had become enslaved to false gods, bound by fear to beings who consumed and destroyed. Even the animals had been corrupted, twisted into unnatural forms through dark manipulation. God saw it all. He looked upon the earth and beheld how corrupt it had become. Every creature had corrupted its way. Violence filled the land. The boundaries of creation had been violated in every conceivable manner. The Nephilim ruled as false gods. Humanity worshipped demons. The knowledge of the Watchers had turned the world into a place of sorcery, bloodshed, and rebellion. Genesis records God's response. "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them." This was not capricious anger. It was divine sorrow in the face of total corruption. The world God had made good had been twisted beyond recognition. The only solution was to unmake it, to wash it clean and begin again. The antediluvian world at its darkest hour was a civilization built entirely on falsehood. The giants claimed to be gods but were abominations. The priests claimed to mediate divine truth but served unclean spirits. The knowledge humanity possessed had been stolen from heaven and used for evil. The religion practiced at every altar was an inversion of true worship. Blood poured out in honor of beings who had no right to receive it. Sacrifices were offered to demons disguised as deities. The Book of Jasher describes how the earth became filled with robbery and violence. Men took what they wanted without regard for justice or law. Women were seized by force. Property was stolen openly. Judges accepted bribes and perverted justice. The strong oppressed the weak without consequence. The corrupt governed the innocent. There was no safety, no peace, no righteousness. The spiritual darkness matched the physical violence. Humanity had not merely forgotten God, they had replaced him. They served the Nephilim, worshipped their spirits, and followed the teachings of the Watchers. They consulted astrologers instead of prophets. They sought power through sorcery instead of wisdom through obedience. They trusted in weapons of war instead of in divine protection. Every impulse, every thought, every action was oriented away from the Creator and toward the corrupted order the fallen angels had established. The land cried out. The blood of the innocent soaked into the ground, and the earth itself groaned under the weight of sin. The corruption was so deep that even the animals had been affected. The entire created order had been defiled. What had begun with the descent of the Watchers and the birth of the Nephilim had spread until nothing remained untouched. Only Noah and his family stood apart. They had not bowed to the giants. They had not participated in the sorcery. They had not shed innocent blood. Noah walked with God in a world that had forgotten him. He was a preacher of righteousness in a generation that had no interest in righteousness. He was a light in a darkness so complete that the light seemed strange. God looked upon the earth and saw that the time had come. The corruption was complete. The violence was unbearable. The rebellion was total. The world could not continue as it was. The Nephilim had to be destroyed. The altars had to be drowned. The priesthoods had to be silenced. The knowledge of the Watchers had to be buried beneath water and sediment. A declaration was made. "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth." The antediluvian world, with its giants, its corrupted religion, its sorcery, its violence, its hybrid creatures, and its total rebellion, was about to end. The waters were coming, and only the righteous would be saved. God saw the corruption. He saw the giants walking as false gods across the earth. He saw the altars running with blood. He saw the temples where corrupted priests invoked the names of demons. He saw humanity bowing before beings who had no right to receive worship. He saw the violence that filled every corner of the world, and he decided that the world must be washed clean. Flood was not a random catastrophe. It was not a natural disaster that happened to coincide with human wickedness. It was divine judgment, a deliberate response to the specific evil of Nephilim worship and the rebellion of the Watchers. The corruption had become so complete, so pervasive, that only total destruction could cleanse the earth. God declared his intention. "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air." But before the waters rose, judgment came to the Watchers themselves. The Book of Enoch describes how God sent the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, to deal with the fallen angels who had started it all. These were not minor angels. These were the highest servants of God, dispatched to execute judgment on the rebels who had violated the order of heaven. God commanded Raphael to bind Azazel, the watcher who had taught men to forge weapons and women to adorn themselves in vanity. Raphael was instructed to cast Azazel into the desert, into an opening filled with rough and jagged rocks. His face was to be covered so that he could see no light. He was to remain there in darkness until the day of final judgment, when he would be cast into the fire. This was necessary, the text explains, so that all the children of men would not perish as a result of the knowledge Azazel had shared with them. God commanded Gabriel to destroy the offspring of the Watchers, the Nephilim themselves. Gabriel was told to proceed against the bastards and the reprobates, and against the children of fornication, and destroy the children of the Watchers from amongst men. The giants had to die. Their existence was an abomination. Their rule had to end. God commanded Michael to bind Semjaza and the other leaders of the Watchers. They were to be imprisoned in the valleys of the earth, bound in darkness for 70 generations until the day of their judgment. Then they would be cast into the abyss of fire, where they would remain forever. The punishment was clear. The Watchers would be confined beneath the earth, unable to influence humanity, unable to see the light of day, held in chains until the final reckoning. The judgment of the Watchers was swift and final. The angels who had descended to Mount Hermon, who had taken human wives, who had taught forbidden knowledge, were now bound in darkness. They could no longer walk the earth. They could no longer corrupt humanity directly. They were imprisoned beneath the ground, waiting for the day when they would face eternal fire. Their rebellion had ended not in triumph but in chains. But the judgment was not complete. The Nephilim still walked the earth. The altars still stood. The corrupted priesthoods still performed their dark rituals. The knowledge the Watchers had taught was still being practiced. The world remained polluted by the consequences of angelic rebellion, and so God decreed a cleansing that would be total. He commanded Noah to build an ark. This was not merely a survival vessel. It was a declaration that judgment was coming and that only the righteous would be preserved. Noah was given precise instructions, dimensions, materials, the structure of rooms. He was told to bring his family and representatives of every kind of animal. Everything else would perish. Noah obeyed. For years he built the ark while the world around him continued in its corruption. The giants still ruled. The priests still chanted their incantations. The altars still received their bloody sacrifices. But Noah worked in faith, believing that God would do what he had promised. He became a preacher of righteousness, warning the generation around him that judgment was coming. They did not listen. The waters began to rise. Genesis records that all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. This was not ordinary rain. The earth itself split open. Water poured from beneath the ground and fell from above in torrents. The flood was a cosmic event. Creation itself was being undone and remade. The waters rose for 40 days and 40 nights. They covered the hills. They swallowed the valleys. They climbed higher and higher until even the tallest mountains were submerged beneath more than 20 feet of water. Nothing on the surface of the earth could survive. The Nephilim perished. The giants who had claimed to be gods, who had ruled through strength and terror, who had demanded worship and received it, they drowned. Their physical bodies, so much larger and stronger than Orden. Ari men could not save them from the waters. They gasped for air as the flood rose around them. They struggled against the currents, and they died, every single one. The false priests drowned alongside their giant masters. The men who had chanted incantations, who had invoked the secret names of demons, who had performed rituals at corrupted altars, they were swept away by the flood. Their robes and crowns sank into the mud. Their sacred texts dissolved or were buried beneath layers of sediment. Their knowledge was lost. The altars were submerged. The megalithic structures that had stood as monuments to the power of the Nephilim were buried beneath water and sediment. The stones that only giants could move disappeared beneath the rising flood. The blood that had been poured out upon them was washed away. The temples where corrupted priesthoods had served unclean spirits were drowned and covered. Every physical trace of Nephilim worship was erased. Genesis records that all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. The corruption that had spread through the animal kingdom was purged. The hybrid creatures that should never have existed perished. The boundaries of creation, so thoroughly violated in the antediluvian world, were about to be restored. Only Noah and those with him in the ark survived. 8 people, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. They floated above a world that was being unmade. Below them, the civilization of the Nephilim was being destroyed. The cities built by giants were collapsing. The altars were being buried. The corrupted works of the Watchers were being swallowed by water and mud. The flood was not merely destructive. It was cleansing. God was washing the earth, removing the pollution that the rebellion of the Watchers had introduced. The violence was being ended. The false worship was being silenced. The giants who had ruled as tyrants were being destroyed. The world was being reset. The waters remained for months. They covered the earth for 150 days before they began to recede. When they finally withdrew, the world that emerged was transformed. The antediluvian civilization was gone. The Nephilim were dead. Their bodies had returned to dust, though their spirits remained as demons to afflict later generations. The altars were buried beneath layers of sediment. The temples were destroyed. The sacred texts were lost. The flood represented a cosmic reset. The rebellion that had begun with the descent of the Watchers had been decisively ended. The corrupted religious system the Nephilim had established, with its blood sacrifices, its megalithic altars, its false priesthoods, and its worship of giants as gods, had been completely destroyed. The world that had been filled with violence and corruption was now empty, waiting to be renewed. Noah emerged from the ark into a world washed clean. The first thing he did was build an altar, not to the Nephilim but to the Lord. He offered burnt offerings in thanksgiving and worship to the true God. This was a declaration. The world had been cleansed. The false gods were gone. Worship would now be directed to the Creator alone. God made a covenant with Noah. He promised never again to destroy the earth with a flood. He set a rainbow in the sky as a sign of that covenant. The judgment had been executed. The corruption had been purged. The Nephilim and their religion had been swept away. A new beginning was possible. The Watchers remained bound in darkness, awaiting final judgment. The spirits of the Nephilim wandered the earth as demons, continuing their rebellion in disembodied form. But the physical reign of the giants was over. Their altars were buried. Their temples were destroyed. Their priests were dead. The world before the flood, with all its violence, corruption, and false worship, had been washed away, and only the righteous remained. The flood destroyed the Nephilim's bodies, but it did not erase their memory. The waters receded. The earth dried. Noah and his family stepped out into a world washed clean, but they carried with them the knowledge of what had been, the stories of giants who once ruled the earth, the tales of beings born from the union of angels and humans, the memories of a world dominated by false gods. In the generations after Noah, humanity spread across the earth once again. Languages multiplied, cultures formed, nations arose, and in nearly every culture, stories of giants emerged. These were not identical accounts. They were fragmented, mythologized, adapted to fit different contexts and worldviews, but the echoes were unmistakable. The Greeks told of the Titans, powerful beings of enormous size who ruled before the Olympian gods. They were born from primordial deities and represented a generation that preceded the current divine order. They waged war against the gods and were eventually defeated and imprisoned in Tartarus, a place of darkness beneath the earth. The parallels to the Watchers and Nephilim are striking. Powerful beings who rebelled, were judged, and were bound in darkness. The Norse spoke of the Jotnar, giants who existed before the gods themselves, primordial beings associated with chaos and the untamed forces of nature. They were not entirely evil, but they represented disorder and threat to the established cosmic order. Some gods married giants, blurring the boundaries between divine and chaotic. The Jotnar would eventually break free at Ragnarök, the Norse apocalypse, and wage war against the gods in a final battle that would destroy and renew the world. Again, the themes of boundary violation, divine-human mixing, and apocalyptic judgment echo the biblical narrative. Hindu mythology includes the Asuras, beings of great power who opposed the Devas, the gods. They were not uniformly wicked, but they represented forces that stood in tension with divine order. Like the Titans and Jotnar, the Asuras were mighty beings whose stories involved conflict with the established gods. The pattern repeats across cultures: powerful giants or demigods who challenge divine authority and are eventually subdued or destroyed. These mythologies may represent distorted memories of the Nephilim. The flood had destroyed the giants physically, but it had not erased the human memory of their existence. Noah's descendants remembered. They told their children. The story spread and transformed, adapting to new languages and cultures, but retaining core elements. Beings of great size and power, born from unusual unions, who ruled before being judged. The religious practices of the antediluvian world also reappeared. Megalithic structures rose again in the post-flood world. Stonehenge, the pyramids, massive temples constructed from stones so large that modern scholars still debate how they were moved. Local legends often attribute these structures to giants or beings of extraordinary strength. Whether these were built by post-flood giants or by humans imitating what they remembered from before the deluge, the pattern was clear. Humanity returned to building massive stone monuments. Blood sacrifice reappeared across the ancient world. The Canaanites offered children to Molech. The Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice to Baal Hammon. The Aztecs slaughtered captives by the thousands atop their pyramids. These were not isolated aberrations. They were widespread practices that emerged independently in cultures separated by vast distances. Some scholars suggest these rituals echoed the pre-flood religion of the Nephilim, a system built on blood, fear, and the appeasement of powerful spiritual entities. The worship of divine human hybrids became common in pagan religions. Greek heroes like Heracles were said to be born from unions between gods and mortals. Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be offspring of the gods. Roman emperors declared themselves divine. The pattern of boundary violation that had characterized the Watchers' rebellion, angels taking human wives, was repeated in mythological form as gods mating with humans to produce demigod offspring. But the echoes of the Nephilim were not limited to mythology and pagan practice. The Bible itself records the reappearance of giants after the flood. Numbers 13 describes the Anakim, a race of giants who inhabited Canaan when Israel sent spies to scout the land. The spies reported, "We saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight." These were not metaphorical giants. They were physical beings of extraordinary size, who struck fear into the hearts of trained warriors. The Rephaim are mentioned repeatedly in Scripture as another race of giants. Deuteronomy describes Og, king of Bashan, as the last of the Rephaim, noting that his bed was 13 feet long. The Emim and Zamzumim were other giant. clans mentioned in biblical texts. These post-flood giants inhabited the land of Canaan and the surrounding regions. How did giants return after the flood destroyed them all? Scholars offer different theories. Some suggest that the corruption reoccurred, that fallen angels once again violated the boundary between heaven and earth, producing a second generation of Nephilim. Others propose that the giants mentioned after the flood were simply very tall humans, not true Nephilim. Still others point to Genesis 6:4, which states, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that," suggesting that the text itself anticipates giants appearing both before and after the flood. Regardless of how they returned, the presence of post-flood giants indicates that the threat had not been entirely eliminated. The worship patterns associated with the Nephilim reappeared as well. The prophets of Israel repeatedly warned against returning to the practices of the pre-flood world. Israel was commanded to destroy the giant clans of Canaan. This was not arbitrary cruelty. It was a continuation of the divine judgment that had begun with the flood. The Anakim, Rephaim, and other giant peoples represented a resurgence of the corruption that had necessitated the deluge. They had to be removed from the land God was giving to his people. The prophets warned repeatedly against idolatry and the religious practices associated with pagan nations. These warnings were not about abstract theology. They addressed specific practices: child sacrifice, temple prostitution, divination, sorcery, that echoed the corrupted religion of the antediluvian world. The prophets called Israel back to the worship of the true God and away from the patterns established by the Nephilim and their demonic spirits. Jeremiah condemned the people for making cakes to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to other gods. Ezekiel denounced Israel for sacrificing their children to idols. Isaiah warned against consulting mediums and spiritists, seeking guidance from the dead rather than from God. These practices were not new inventions. They were revivals of ancient corruptions, religious patterns that had their roots in the worship of the Nephilim and the teachings of the Watchers. The memory of the giants lived on in fragmented, mythologized form. Every culture seemed to remember a time when beings of great power walked the earth. The details varied. The names changed. The theological frameworks differed. But the core memory remained. There were once giants who ruled, who claimed divinity, who were judged and destroyed. The spirits of the Nephilim, the demons who wandered the earth after the flood, continued to inspire false religion. They stood behind the idols of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They received the worship humanity offered to false gods. They perpetuated the religious system their physical bodies had established before the deluge. The altars had changed. The names had changed, but the spiritual reality remained the same. The religion of the Nephilim survived in shadowed form. It was no longer centralized under the rule of physical giants, but it was dispersed across cultures and embedded in pagan practice. The blood sacrifices continued. The megalithic structures rose again. The myths preserved distorted memories of the giants. The demons inspired worship that echoed what their bodies had once demanded. Israel stood as a witness against this corruption. They were called to worship the Creator alone, to reject the practices of the nations, to destroy the giants when they encountered them. They were to be a light in a world still shadowed by the legacy of the Watchers and their offspring. Sometimes they succeeded, often they failed, but the calling remained clear: do not return to the ways of the pre-flood world. The echoes of the giants continued through history, in mythology, in pagan religion, in the occasional reappearance of physical giants who had to be confronted and destroyed. The flood had washed the earth clean, but it had not erased the memory or the spiritual consequences of the Nephilim's reign. Humanity remembered, and humanity, in its fallen state, often repeated the very patterns that had once brought divine judgment. The world after the flood was new, but it carried the scars of what had been before. The story of Nephilim worship does not end with the flood. The waters receded, the giants drowned, the altars were buried, but the corruption did not disappear entirely. The spirits of the Nephilim remained as demons, wandering the earth. The watchers lay bound in darkness, awaiting judgment. The memory of the giants lived on in mythology and pagan practice. The war between light and darkness continued. But the Book of Enoch speaks of a day when all of this will end. A final judgment is coming, a moment when every corrupted work will be destroyed, every rebellious spirit will be silenced, and every false altar will be thrown down forever. This is not a battle that might be won or lost. It is a foregone conclusion. The victory belongs to God. The watchers remain imprisoned beneath the earth, bound in chains of darkness for 70 generations. They cannot escape. They cannot influence humanity as they once did. They wait in their prison, knowing what is coming. The Book of Enoch describes their ultimate fate with clarity. On the day of the great judgment, he shall be cast into the fire. Azazel, who taught men to forge weapons and women to adorn themselves in vanity, will be thrown into the lake of fire. Semjaza and all the leaders of the rebellion will follow. The judgment will not be symbolic, it will be final. The fallen angels who violated the boundary between heaven and earth, who took human wives and fathered the Nephilim, who taught forbidden knowledge and corrupted humanity, they will be cast into eternal fire. There will be no reprieve, no second chance, no escape. The rebellion that began on Mount Hermon will end in the lake of fire. The spirits of the Nephilim, those demons who have wandered the earth since the flood, will be silenced forever. The Book of Revelation describes a final war in which the forces of rebellion are utterly defeated. Satan and his fallen angels will be cast into the lake of fire, where they will be tormented day and night forever. The demons who once walked as giants, who ruled through fear and violence, who demanded worship and received it, they will be destroyed completely. Every false altar will be thrown down. Every corrupted name will be forgotten. The religious system the Nephilim established, the blood sacrifices, the megalithic temples, the priesthoods that served unclean spirits, will be erased from creation. Nothing will remain. Revelation describes the final conflict in vivid terms. Satan will be released from his prison for a short time and will gather the nations for war against the people of God. The forces of rebellion will surround the camp of the saints, but fire will come down from heaven and consume them. There will be no prolonged battle, no desperate struggle. The enemies of God will be destroyed in an instant. Then Satan himself will be cast into the lake of fire, where the beast and the false prophet already are. He will be tormented forever, along with all who followed him in rebellion. The fallen angels, the demons, the spirits of the Nephilim, all will share this fate. The corruption that began before the flood will finally and completely end. The Book of Enoch describes Enoch's vision of the place prepared for the watchers. He saw a terrible place filled with fire, burning flames and pillars of fire that extended to the heavens. He asked the angel guiding him what this place was, and the angel replied that it was the prison prepared for the fallen angels who corrupted the earth. This is their ultimate destination, a place of eternal fire where they will remain forever. Until that final day, the memory of the Nephilim remains. It serves as a warning, a reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed, when angels abandon their proper station, when humanity pursues forbidden knowledge, when created beings claim divinity for themselves, when worship is directed toward anything other than the Creator. The story of the Nephilim teaches that rebellion has consequences. The watchers fell and they were bound. The giants ruled and they were destroyed. Their spirits wandered the earth as demons and they will be silenced. The religious system they established spread across the world and it will be erased. Every false god will be exposed. Every corrupted altar will be thrown down. Every name invoked in rebellion will be forgotten. The prophets warned of this day. Isaiah declared that God would punish the powers in the heavens and the kings on the earth. They would be gathered together as prisoners in a pit, shut up in prison, and after many days be punished. Ezekiel described God's judgment against the false gods of the nations. Jeremiah proclaimed that the idols of Babylon would be shattered and the gods of the nations would be destroyed. These were not empty threats. They were prophecies of the final judgment that is coming. Jesus spoke of this day as well. He described a time when the Son of Man would return in glory and separate the righteous from the wicked. He warned of eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. He declared that all who follow in rebellion will share their fate. The judgment will be absolute. The victory will be complete. The final judgment will accomplish what the flood began. The flood destroyed the physical bodies of the Nephilim, but their spirits remained. It buried their altars, but the memory of their worship survived. It silenced their priesthoods, but new priests arose to serve the same demonic forces under different names. The flood was a decisive judgment, but it was not the final one. The final judgment will leave nothing unfinished. The watchers will be cast into the lake of fire. The demons will be silenced forever. Every false god will be destroyed. Every corrupted name will be erased. The legacy of the Nephilim, their worship, their mythology, their spiritual influence, will be completely removed from creation. A new heaven and a new earth will emerge. Revelation describes a world where there is no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. The old order will have passed away. The corruption that began with the descent of the Watchers will be a distant memory, preserved only as a warning to the redeemed. God will dwell with his people. Righteousness will fill the earth, and the rebellion that plagued creation for so long will be ended forever. Until that day comes, the earth remains a battlefield. The spirits of the Nephilim still wander, seeking to oppress and deceive. The memory of the giants still echoes in mythology and false religion. Humanity still faces the temptation to pursue forbidden knowledge, to cross sacred boundaries, to worship created things instead of the Creator. The same patterns that led to judgment before the flood continue to appear in every generation. But the outcome is certain. The Watchers will be cast into fire. The demons will be silenced. The giants and their worship will be erased. Divine justice will triumph. The long war between light and darkness will end with the complete and final victory of God. The story of the Nephilim is a warning written in the memory of humanity. It speaks of boundaries that must not be crossed, knowledge that must not be pursued, worship that must be directed only to the Creator. It tells of giants who claimed divinity but were mortal, of priests who served demons but called them gods, of a world so corrupted that only water could cleanse it. It reminds every generation that rebellion has consequences, that corruption cannot stand forever, that judgment is real and final. The waters rose, the giants fell, the earth was washed clean, but the story did not end there. The memory remained, the spirits wandered, the corruption reappeared in altered forms, and so the world waits for the final chapter, the day when the Watchers are thrown into the lake of fire, when the demons are silenced, when every false altar is destroyed, when the legacy of the Nephilim is erased completely. That day is coming. The judgment is certain. The victory is assured. And when it arrives, the earth will rest at last. The rebellion will be finished. The corruption will be removed. And creation will be made new, free from the shadow of the giants who once walked as gods among men. The giants have fallen. The final judgment awaits, and divine justice will have the last word. The journey is complete. The story has been told. From the descent of the Watchers to the final judgment that awaits, the narrative of Nephilim worship has unfolded across the ages. It is a story that begins in heaven and ends in fire, that spans from before the flood to the end of all things, that touches every generation and echoes in every culture. It began with a choice. Angels who were meant to serve God looked upon the daughters of men and desired them. They abandoned their heavenly station and descended to Mount Hermon, where they made a pact of rebellion. 200 watchers fell together, bound by an oath that none would bear the guilt alone. They took human wives. They violated the boundary between celestial and mortal. And from those unions came the Nephilim, beings neither fully angel nor fully human, giants who walked the earth as living symbols of cosmic crime. The Watchers did not simply father giants and disappear. They remained on earth as teachers, sharing knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess. Azazel taught metallurgy and warfare, turning peaceful communities into armed civilizations capable of mass violence. Semjaza taught sorcery and enchantments, opening doors to spiritual forces that should have remained closed. Barakajal taught astrology, turning humanity's gaze from the Creator to the stars. Each Watcher contributed another piece of forbidden wisdom, accelerating the corruption of the world. The Nephilim grew in size, strength, and appetite. They consumed the labor of men until nothing remained, then turned to consuming flesh itself. But beyond their physical dominance, they cultivated an aura of divinity. They positioned themselves as intermediaries between heaven and earth, claiming authority over rituals, harvests, and the very fabric of daily life. Humanity, overwhelmed by their power and terrified of their wrath, began to worship them. Altars were built in their honor. Sacrifices were offered to secure their favor. The cursed offspring of fallen angels had become objects of religious devotion. The worship was brutal and physical. Massive stone altars rose across the antediluvian world, constructed from megaliths that only beings of great strength could move. Blood was poured out in rivers. Animals were slaughtered in vast numbers. And when the corruption deepened, darker offerings followed: infants, captives, the firstborn of conquered tribes. The religion of the Nephilim was not about salvation or enlightenment. It was about power, fear, and the binding of humanity to a corrupted order. The giants did not conduct their worship alone. They established priesthoods, human servants who acted as intermediaries, preserving forbidden texts, performing rituals, and chanting liturgies taught by the fallen Watchers. These priests wore robes and crowns. They spoke in ancient tongues. They claimed to interpret the will of the giants and the stars. They were granted knowledge of astrology, divination, incantations, and the secret names of angels and demons. They became the religious elite of the antediluvian world, serving not the Creator but unclean spirits and the hybrid beings who ruled through violence. When the Nephilim died, their story did not end. Because they were born of both spirit and flesh, their deaths were different from ordinary mortality. Their bodies returned to dust, but their spirits remained bound to the earth, unable to ascend to heaven. These disembodied spirits became demons, the unclean entities that wandered the world, seeking to oppress, deceive, and corrupt humanity. They whispered in dreams. They drove people to madness. They inspired idolatry and false religion. The worship of the Nephilim did not die with the flood. It continued in altered form, as humanity unknowingly venerated the lingering spirits of the giants. By the time of Noah, the earth was unrecognizable. Genesis says simply that the earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence. But the apocryphal texts expand this picture, describing a civilization that had abandoned the Creator almost entirely. Altars to the giants stood in every valley. Blood sacrifice was commonplace. Sorcery and astrology dominated religious life. Even the animals had been corrupted, their boundaries violated through dark manipulation. The world had become so broken that God declared it must be destroyed. The flood was not random catastrophe. It was divine judgment, a response to the specific evil of Nephilim worship and the rebellion of the Watchers. God sent archangels to bind the fallen angels in darkness until the final judgment. He commanded the earth to open and swallow their corrupted works. The waters rose for 40 days and 40 nights, covering even the highest mountains. Every giant perished. Every false priest drowned. Every altar was submerged beneath miles of water and sediment. Only Noah and his family survived, 8 people preserved to begin again. But the flood did not erase the memory. In the generations after Noah, humanity retained distorted recollections of the giants and their religion. These memories became the foundation for pagan mythology, the Greek Titans, the Norse Jotnar, the Hindu Asuras. The practice of building megalithic temples, offering blood sacrifices, and worshipping divine human hybrids reappeared in cultures across the world. The prophets warned Israel repeatedly against returning to the practices of the pre-flood world. The spirits of the Nephilim, wandering as demons, continued to inspire false religion and idolatry. The story does not end with the flood. It ends with the final judgment. The Book of Enoch speaks of a day when the bound watchers will be released from their prison and cast into the lake of fire. The spirits of the Nephilim, those demons that still wander the earth, will be silenced forever. Every false altar will be thrown down. Every corrupted name will be forgotten. Revelation describes a final war in which the forces of rebellion are utterly defeated. The giants, their worship, and their legacy will be erased from creation. But until that day, the memory remains, a warning, a reminder of what happens when boundaries are crossed, when forbidden knowledge is pursued, when humanity forgets its creator and worships created things instead. The Nephilim claimed divinity but were mortal. The Watchers rebelled but were bound. The altars stood but were drowned. The demons wander but will be silenced. The waters have risen, the giants have fallen, and one day the earth will rest at last. The rebellion will be finished. The corruption will be removed, and divine justice will have the final word. The story of Nephilim worship is complete. May its lessons not be forgotten.